The city of Libertalia may have been the greatest pirate city that ever existed. It had its own flag, its own government, and even an alliance with a major world power. And yet today, no one knows where it was or even if it really existed at all. There are two reasons for this. The first is that much of our knowledge about it comes from the writings of a man named Captain Charles Johnson. He is best known for his book, A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, published in 1724. This book describes a history of many infamous pirates, including Blackbeard, Henry Morgan, and Bartholomew Roberts. But Johnson also described the existence of a secret pirate republic located somewhere off the coast of North America. He claimed that after a pirate named François L'Olivier left France to escape prosecution for a crime he did uncommit, he landed in a place called the Isle of Libertalia. Over time, more and more pirates arrived on the island, until eventually there were enough of them to form their own society. The second reason we do know much about the city is because it only existed for around a decade. From roughly 1716 to 1726. That isn't very long at all, especially when compared to other famous pirate cities like Port Royal in Jamaica, which existed for over half a century. But considering how little time it was around, Libertalia managed to become one of the wealthiest settlements in history. When the French pirate Olivier arrived in the area, he found only a small number of people living on the island, a group of Spaniards who had settled there illegally. Olivier quickly forced them to leave and then began to build his own settlement. At some point during this time, he sent a letter back to France explaining what he had done and inviting other French criminals to join him. Eventually, hundreds of convicts arrived on the island. However, they soon got into a fight with Olivier, killing him and several of his allies. After this, the island fell under the control of two rival groups. One was led by a man named Abraham Kennan, Diagraph, who had previously been an officer in the Dutch Navy. The other was led by the notorious pirate captain Bartholomew Roberts. These two men were mortal enemies and spent most of their time fighting each other. Eventually, Roberts would get the upper hand and kill or exile Kennedy's men. With his enemies gone, Roberts set about turning the island into a pirate paradise. He established a constitution, minted coins, and recruited men for his fleet. His ships would sail all over the Caribbean, attacking Spanish treasure ships and coastal settlements. In total, Roberts plundered more than 400 vessels and became one of the richest men in the world. However, he was uninterested in amassing wealth for himself, but instead wanted to use it to improve the lives of his fellow pirates. In fact, he essentially created the world's first welfare state. Roberts believed that every member of his fleet deserved to retire with a fortune, and so he split his loot amongst his crew. He also built houses, schools, and hospitals on the island. To further cement his legacy, he commissioned an artist to paint a portrait of him, which he then distributed throughout the settlement. But despite all the good things he did, Roberts was still a vicious pirate and often treated the locals poorly. In fact, he and his men were responsible for the deaths of hundreds of innocent people. Eventually, the governor of the nearby British colony of Carolina got wind of what was happening and assembled a fleet to attack the island. Realizing that he was in danger, Roberts led a group of men to defend the city, while the rest of the fleet went out to sea to hide. But Roberts would not survive the battle. He was killed by a cannonball, which severed one of his legs and then crushed him. When the city fell, the survivors fled into the forest and were hunted down by the British. Many were killed, but a few escaped. Despite the defeat, Libertalia remained occupied for several years afterwards by various pirate crews. But eventually everyone left and the settlement was completely abandoned. Today, we don't know exactly where the city was located. The most popular theory is that it was on an island near present-day Cape Patras, although other scholars have suggested that it may have been on an island in the Bahamas or off the coast of Florida. As for why the city was never found, there are two possibilities. The first is that it simply fell into the ocean due to rising sea levels. This could explain why there is no trace of it today, and why the earliest European maps of the region do not show any islands that could possibly be Libertalia. The second possibility is that the city was deliberately erased from existence. After all, The British destroyed most of the city and killed or exiled most of the residents. It seems likely that they would have also tried to cover up the existence of the city. Ultimately, we may never know what happened to Libertalia, or if it ever really existed. But one thing is for sure, if the stories are true, it was one of the most prosperous cities in history. During the golden age of piracy, which lasted from the 1650s to the 1730s, there were around 800 pirate settlements scattered across the Caribbean and the coast of North America. But none were as advanced or as powerful as Libertalia. In fact, the pirates in this city were so successful that they actually formed an alliance with one of the world's great powers. We're talking about the Kingdom of England. You see, by the early 1700s, the English had grown tired of fighting wars with the Spaniards to try and capture the riches of the New World. Instead, they decided to ally themselves with the people who were doing the job for them, the pirates. In 1704, King George I granted the majority of England's pirates a noble title, granting them noble titles and allowing them to keep their fortunes. The king also promised them amnesty for any crimes they had committed before, but only if they agreed to stop pirating. Of course, this didn't stop all piracy in the Caribbean, but it did weaken the pirates' forces significantly. And that's not all. The English also enlisted the help of one of the most infamous pirates of all time, Henry Morgan. They knighted him and made him the governor of the Jamaican port city of Port Royal. In this position, Morgan was tasked with capturing other pirates and bringing them to justice. Of course, some pirates were able to escape, such as Blackbeard, who pillaged on the riches of both the English and the Spaniards, but most were captured and hanged. Eventually, Morgan himself grew too greedy and corrupt to rule Port Royal and was removed from office. He lived the remainder of his life in relative poverty, dying in 1688. One of the main reasons why the English allied themselves with the pirates was because they hated the Spaniards even more. For centuries, the two nations had fought each other in Europe, the Americas, and the Far East, and the competition was fierce. Both sides were willing to do anything to gain an advantage over the other, including breaking the law. In fact, many of the Caribbean pirates were given their start by the Spaniards. See, at the time, Spain was the dominant naval power in the Caribbean. But they had a problem. They needed ships to transport gold and silver back to Spain from their colonies in the Americas. The only way to make this possible was by building massive fleets. But not only were these ships expensive to build, they were also expensive to maintain. So the Spaniards came up with a solution. They paid privateers to protect their ships. Privateers were basically legal pirates. If a Spaniard was attacked by another European ship, he could declare war on them and plunder their vessel. This meant the Spaniards didn't have to worry about losing their treasure, and the European powers weren't willing to risk angering the Spaniards by interfering. Eventually, this system grew so large that it became impossible to manage. Many privateers took advantage of the chaos and began plundering Spanish ships without declaring war. When the Spaniards complained to the Europeans, they refused to intervene. That's why the Spaniards began sending treasure fleets to the Caribbean. This way, they could avoid the waters where the privateers operated. Of course, this didn't work either. The privateers simply followed the treasure fleets and stole their cargo. That's when the Caribbean exploded in piracy. Entire settlements sprang up across the region, and thousands of ships were plundered. Today, we live in a world where it's nearly impossible to become a billionaire. There's so much competition and so much regulation that it takes decades of hard work just to earn a few $1,000,000. But it wasn't always like this. In fact, there was a time when a person could become incredibly wealthy in a matter of months. And all it would take is one lucky voyage to the Caribbean. Thanks for watching.